All right, folks, we'll start here with skill five, which is going to be building on the last skill that we practiced by adding sources to our analysis. Basically, we're going to learn how to read a source, find evidence to support a claim about that source, and then explain how the evidence supports our claim. So let's get started. So the goal with this skill is to make an argument while using a source. We will then need specific evidence to support the claim, followed by an explanation of how the evidence supports the claim. So the first thing to note is that you see this skill all the time in a lot of your different classes. In English, you may have heard of it referred to as point evidence analysis. In science, you may have heard it as claim evidence reasoning. No matter what class it is, you're doing the same thing. You're creating an argument, finding evidence to support your argument, and explaining how the evidence you've cited does, in fact, support your claim. In this case, though, you may have to make a claim based on information you pull from a source. In AP US History, you'll see it in certain SAQs, as in the example that we'll practice here in a minute. And every year, one of the SAQ questions will be in this format. It could also be in a DBQ, and it'll be really important there because you're going to have documents that you will need to build arguments based upon, okay? So here are the steps that we're going to go through. Step one is to answer the question with a historically defensible claim. In this case, though, you have a source you'll need to refer to when creating your claim. Step two is to brainstorm evidence that supports your answer. You want the evidence to be as specific as possible. So avoid being general or too vague. So instead of saying something like the Industrial Revolution, talk about the creation of the Erie Canal. Step three is to explain how your evidence connects to your argument. As I said before, this is the step that students struggle with the most. As you get started, don't worry about writing the smoothest essay. Instead, make sure you clearly explain the connection that you're making. I find the sentence stem, "This supports my claim because," really helpful. It's also helpful to break down the question as we did last time, right? So your evidence needs to connect to both parts or both stems of the question. Often your source will connect clearly to one of the stems, but not so much to the other. So it's up to you to make that connection clear. So we're going to practice now with a typical SAQ question that has a source prompt, okay? So here, our first question will always ask you to explain the difference between the two historians' interpretations of events. So again, I'll start with the source line. Our first source comes from the historian Perry Miller, from a biography he published in 1949 of Jonathan Edwards. As I read his excerpt, I notice that Miller calls Edwards an artist who worked through topics like the will and sin as problems of life. He concludes by saying that Edwards used facts, which reminds me of an Enlightenment thinker. The second excerpt is from another historian, Peter Gay, who wrote about Puritan historians in colonial America in 1966. Interestingly, the title is A Loss of Mastery, suggesting that Puritan historians lost something. As I read his excerpts, I notice words like reaffirm the faith of his fathers, and his own thinking deviated from the thinking about to seize control of educated opinion. He concludes by saying that even if Edwards was excited by the ideas of Newton and Locke, he couldn't create a language of religion that matched. In fact, his results were pathetic, according to Gay. So the next two questions asks us to describe how one specific piece of evidence supports each historian's interpretations. For Miller, I would use Edwards' most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Here, Edwards argued that man was but an insect being held by the hand of God over the fire of damnation. The only thing saving us from righteous damnation, according to Edwards, was God's grace. This supports Miller's argument that Edwards is a positive symbol of the Enlightenment because it shows Edwards' use of logic to come to a conclusion. Since God is all-powerful and man is sinful, it must be God's grace that keeps mankind from the flames. Interestingly, I could use the same evidence to support Gay's argument. Here, I would say that Edwards' argument is still reliant on religious beliefs instead of the more scientific, rational bent of the Enlightenment. So, right, here's my answers to each of those parts. Miller argues Edwards was a key figure of the American Enlightenment because he thought about the problems of his era with a more modern, less theocratic sensibility. Gay, on the other hand, argues Edwards was trapped by his thinking and that no matter how interested in enlightenment thought he was, he could not overcome his limitations. Right? Edwards' sermon is in the hand of the aid of God supports Miller's interpretation because Edward uses logic to argue that God's grace is the only thing standing between mankind and deserved damnation. And then C, the same sermon supports Gay's interpretation because ultimately Edwards is still answering questions with religion, instead of more scientific rational trends found in the Enlightenment. So now it's your turn to practice, and we'll go from there. Okay, good luck. If you have any questions, you know who to ask.